Hello, and welcome to Tech Asia Live, what Trump's trade war means for Asia's supply chains. I'm your host, Katie Creel, Nikkei Asia's tech editor in Tokyo. Today, I'm joined by Cissy in Hong Kong and Cheng Ting-Fang in Taipei, two of our most experienced tech reporters. Let's start with some introductions. Cissy, please take it away.
Hello, thank you, Katie. Hello, everybody. Thanks for attending our webinar. I am Cissy, and I am based in Hong Kong. So I have been covering China's tech sector for Nikkei Asia for more than 3 years. Previously, I covered China's economy and politics for a few other international publications. And now I work very closely with Katie and Annie on China's business movements, including AI, e-commerce, EV, and other supply chain related stories.
Thanks, Cissy. Annie, how are you doing today?
Yes, I'm good. Hi, I'm very glad to see everyone online. This is Ting-Fang, or many of my colleagues call me Annie. I primarily cover the global semiconductor and electronic hardware supply chain, from chip design manufacturing to chip packaging, chemicals, equipment, and components like displays and PCBs. At Nikkei Asia, we also closely track major players such as Apple, HP, Dell, and the broader smartphone PC server ecosystem, as well as the development of Huawei supply chains and China's tech advancement in chips and electronics. So there are a lot to talk about related to Trump 2.0 and the new geopolitical environments. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Annie, and I couldn't agree more. We have a lot of ground to cover today. But before we get started, I would just like to ask our listeners to please stay tuned at the end of the webinar. We'll have a QR code for an audience survey, as well as information on how to listen to an archived video of this event. So thank you. And without further ado, let's get started. So China and US decoupling is not a new trend. It started at least back in the Trump 1.0 administration. He came to office with a rather hawkish approach on China. There were tariffs back then as well. And many of his policies were continued or expanded upon by his predecessor, Joe Biden, who also, in addition to export controls on tech exports to China, tried to kickstart a tech manufacturing renaissance back in the US. And that fueled the diversification of supply chains even further. And then Trump was reelected in November, and that spurred a lot more preparation and planning and scrambling by supply chains out in Asia here. They were expecting a lot of tariffs and maybe some more hawkish policies on China. But what actually happened has been, I think, beyond what a lot of people were expecting. Slide 1, please. So the start of his term got off fairly mildly. There were some tariffs increased over the fentanyl issues, some China retaliating, but things really kicked off on April 2nd with the reciprocal tariffs that Trump imposed, saying that he wanted to address unfair trade practices, encourage more manufacturing to come back to the US, and to kind of achieve a lot of his policy aims. China responded quite strongly, and things have developed from there. But I think today we'd like to start from what was the initial reaction from the supply chain to those April 2nd reciprocal tariffs, which were quite shockingly high. Annie, yes. I think you have some insights on this one.
Yes, when the announcement came out early morning on April 3rd in Asia, it was a national holiday in Taiwan where I'm based. But just about every tech industry managers and executives supplying to Apple, HP, Dell, Lenovo, Samsung, Amazon, Microsoft, Google were very shocked. That's bring up our slide 2. Asia's tech production hubs exposure to the US and China. Yes. Why? Suddenly, some of their most critical electronics manufacturing hubs, not only China and Taiwan, to Vietnam and Thailand, were facing tariffs as high as 30-something% to 46% if they are shipping to the US. And the situation was incredibly fluid. There was this sudden 90 days pause and a temporary exemption for some key tech products like smartphones and laptops. I have many friends working in the electronic supply chain, and they describe this experience as nerve-wracking and exhausting. At one point, their customers told them to hold all US bound shipments, and then almost overnight, everything flip again. So who's likely to be hit the hardest? At least 5 executives from chip and tech circle told me they still don't have clear picture and visibility of the second half of 2025. Recovery for non-AI products are still low, so they are worried about the outlook. And the most vulnerable right now are those small and the medium-sized suppliers who count US market heavily. They don't have the resources to quickly ship productions across multiple countries, and now they expect their biggest clients to push for more price cuts in the coming quarters as those tech giants worry about their own margins as well. The problem is these smaller suppliers are already operating on a razor-thin profits, so every squeeze could hurt. That said, some executives point out that a lot of the panic might be unnecessary. In the face of such a rapid and unpredictable changes, one phrase I heard sums it up well: meeting all changes with no change. In other words, stay focused on the longer term and don't overreact to the short-term chaos.
That would take a lot of nerve to react to all this uncertainty without changing your long-term vision. Cissy, you have some insights from the consumer angle to all of this.
Yeah. I will add some of my observations on the consumer sector in addition to what Annie has already mentioned. So the Chinese producers have definitely gone through multiple rounds of chaos. So particularly with the elimination, pause, and then resumption over the de minimis rules. So which allows items under $800 to enter the US tariffs free. And that is also a cornerstone to most of the Chinese cross-border e-commerce platforms, particularly Temu, Shein, and Alibaba Express. So the removal of the de minimis rule has really disrupted the business models of those e-commerce platforms. So initially, these platforms, they stopped shipping goods directly from China because the tariffs were much higher than the value of the items themselves, so which is really ridiculous. So, for example, if a T-shirt is like $10, you have to pay like $15 US tariffs. So, which a lot of the consumers cannot accept. So, and then with Trump cutting the tariffs on small parcels to as low as 30% from 120% last week. So the US importers already started to front load again, and the platforms started to ship some items from China to the US directly again. So in terms of which products are impacted most, I would say it really depends on the margin. So for some Chinese products, even if the tariffs are 50%, Chinese sellers can still make a profit. But for some products, once the tariff goes up to even 30%, and then they will be struggling to make profit. So it really varies. And now, so let's take a look at the slide that we from one of my recent story. So what we can see is that, because of the tariffs, Temu and Shein, they are significantly slashing their ad spending in the US market, and then they are shifting that part of budget to the European market. But what is a little bit ironically is that at this moment, even Europe and Japan, so they are talking about, put tariffs on those low-value Chinese items. So which is really challenging for those platforms. And now we also see that the G7 countries have started to discuss tariffs on those platforms. So there are a lot of challenges ahead. And then lastly, I want to add something is that, I talked to Chinese platforms and Chinese sellers. So during this grace period, they are still, observing. And then they will see what happens first. And then they will decide what to do next, because they need to see if the US importers will be able to source from elsewhere, which I believe would be really difficult.
Sounds like there is a lot of wait and see and a lot of uncertainty, which seems to be almost more painful than the tariffs themselves, is not knowing what the policy is going to be from day to day. Which does bring us to our next question about the 90-day grace period. So how did companies react after they were suddenly told, you've got basically a 3-month reprieve, prepare? Cissy, did you see any companies taking advantage of this, or how did they react?
Yeah, I'll continue what I was, talking about. So first of all, as a lot of, the audience might have seen, is that companies, they started to stockpile again, because no one knows what will happen after 90 days. So they're doing what they can do. And then, Christmas is not that far away. They need to get enough inventory, right? So, and also some of the companies, they are changing, shipments from sea cargo to air cargo, because they wanted to get the stuff to the US first as soon as possible. And for some bigger manufacturers, because of the tariff, they are also, changing the final assembly countries as soon as possible. For example, they can move the parts from one country, from China to a third country, and then they do the final assembly there, and then they can label, produced in Laos, just for example. And then also, on the US front, what we heard is that the importers, they're also trying do the multi-sourcing. They're trying to source from other countries. But we heard that some of those multi-sourcing is not that good, because even at the same price, the product's quality might not be as good as China, because China is, to be honest, is highly efficient in supply chain. And then, as I just mentioned, like nobody knows what will happen in 90 days, because Trump is highly unpredictable. And at this moment, he's also trying to, negotiating deals with individual countries. And I think even he manages to reach deals with some, countries like Vietnam. And then, the content of the deal will still be subject to changes, given, what kind of person Trump is. But for the long term, I think the consensus is to reshore production, which would be hard to reverse because it involves a lot of investments. So previously, when companies considering where to build their factories, cost is always a priority. So, but I think from now on, at least in the next 4 years, other considerations such as a country's trade deficit with the US might become a major consideration for diversification, and which is to say Vietnam will no longer be the only option for those global companies' diversification.
Thanks, Cissy. So in brief, it sounds like 90 days is not enough time to make any big changes, and certainly not to make any progress on those changes. Annie, I think you've seen this in the tech supply chain very clearly.
Yes, but I would say that without these 90 days, it's no longer possible to return to the peaceful good old days when people could just assume everything would arrive on time and at the best cost. The era of globalization, where goods and people could move around freely without major disruptions, is over. We've been closely following this supply chain shift since Trump 1.0 in 2018. I still remember when we first exclusively reported that Apple's AirPods would start being made in Vietnam. out of China for the first time. That was a big deal back then, but it took years until late 2023 for Apple to finally begin producing all of its major product lines outside of China, and that only starting from small volume. So even now, things aren't so straightforward. For example, some MacBooks may be labeled as made in Vietnam, but in reality, Apple suppliers carry out only specific manufacturing steps there. For instance, surface mount technology, or SMT, the process of mounting chips, components onto print circuit boards, can be now done in Vietnam. However, some semi-finished products then need to ship back to China for final assembly and testing. Many key components, from casing to mechanical parts, are still most efficiently and reliably produced in China. So here, please help me bring up the slide 3, Apple's production footprints in China. So Apple has clearly put in a lot of efforts to diversify, but the pace hasn't been as fast as many expected. We've been tracking their suppliers move closely, and in their supplier list disclosed in 2024, despite all these efforts, you can see 84% of Apple's top 187 suppliers still have facilities in China producing parts or do assemblies for China. You can see these hubs and clusters are still very, very visible and large. And if you compare with other places like Vietnam, Thailand, India is emerging, but it's of course not this complete. And HP just also start its very aggressive push since last year to Thailand and Mexico. Dell also start its out of China push back in late 2022, mainly in Vietnam. So yes, like Cissy said, the shift is going on to the Southeast Asia is real, and it's not reversing because of 90 days or so on, but it's a long and complicated journey. Also, they are super shocked when their most significant out of China bases of Thailand and the Vietnam are also subject to that high tariffs. Yeah, back to you.
Thanks, Annie. I definitely would not want to be a tech supply chain executive these days. It's a really striking chart looking at Apple's production footprint in China still, but I think it speaks to how long they spent building up that supply chain, and you can't dismantle it overnight. So no matter how high the tariffs are, to be honest. And tariffs, however, aren't the only issue in the US-China trade war. There's also export controls on American tech, as Washington would very much like to curtail China's ambitions in AI and other advanced techs. So Trump did recently scrap a Biden-era rule on AI chips, the AI diffusion rule, saying it was too complicated, it was unenforceable. But he, at the same time, introduced another restriction saying that no one anywhere should be using Huawei's chips. And that did not go down well in Beijing. Cissy, I think you have some comments to share on this?
Yes. So we have seen that obviously Beijing has got really pissed off over the US restriction on the use of Huawei's Ascend chips. So and recently we can see the Chinese government, including MOFCOM and Foreign Ministry, they have repeatedly condemned the White House move. And I also, interestingly, I have seen, quite a few questions raised. So if the US government move will impact Chinese companies' use of Huawei chips, because those companies, they have already using Ascend due to the restrictions on NVIDIA's chips. And I think the answer is no, because, for Chinese companies, they can only use, Huawei's chips. Because it cannot access NVIDIA's most advanced ones. But it might impact companies who are based outside China, who are using Huawei's Ascend chips. And in terms of NVIDIA, actually we, so me, Annie and Lolly, so we previously broke the story that even before the US imposed restrictions on H20, Chinese companies, including namely Tencent, Alibaba, and ByteDance, they have stockpiled billions worth of NVIDIA chips because the inference demand in China is surging, particularly after the emergence of DeepSeek. And last week, Tencent had a call with analysts, and then their management shared some of the views to the chip ban. And I think their response is quite honest. So I'll just mention some of the highlights from the call, which I think actually represents what the Chinese tech companies are doing. So what they're doing now is first, as I just mentioned, they have stockpiled a lot of chips, and those chips, they can sustain for a few more generations in their training. But on the other hand, Tencent has lowered the priority of its GPU rental business because previously they rent some of the GPUs to outside users to make some revenue. But now they have they're not prioritizing that part, and instead they are prioritizing the use for their own model training, and then the priority is given to business units who can make immediate revenue or profit for the company, such as advertising business. And then at the same time, both and also as well as by Alibaba, they are customizing different sizes of models, because if the size is smaller, the need for computer power is also lower. So in that sense, they can save some use of the GPUs. And then they're also tailor making and distilling models for different use cases to save the usage of the GPUs. And finally, every company admits that they are exploring compliant chip options, including those from domestic makers, as well as so-called legal importation channels.
Thanks, Cissy. I can only imagine how angry Beijing was by the Huawei Ascend rule. And I understand it's a little bit controversial, the US's reasoning for saying no one anywhere in the world should be using these chips because they might somehow violate US export controls. So it's still a contentious issue that we'll have to see how that unfolds. But Tencent is not the only company that's talked about US attempts to control AI tech. I think, Annie, you've heard something interesting from NVIDIA lately.
Yes, I was at Computex this whole week. That's why my voice becomes so hoarse. But hope to share the latest NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang's take on China just in while he's here. He say AI chip export controls are actually a failure, because he said that those bans on US AI chips only boost Chinese experts' spirits to push their governments to invest more in the space. He also shared some revealing numbers. NVIDIA's market share in China has plunged from 95% to about 50% since the export control kicked in. That's because China is now turning to the second best option after being cut off. And who's the second best? Jensen Huang always named Huawei is the most formidable player, innovating incredibly fast, according to him. Huawei's Ascend AI computing platform is having the second largest share in China, while China still faces a lot of restrictions, and likely the Huawei chip production has a lot of hiccups. But sometimes good enough products are all you need to survive. Here I hope to bring up our slide 4. I want to show you another interesting example to everyone. This chart by Nikkei Asia's research on China's chip equipment imports, and we track from custom data. So you can see, despite export control on high-end chip making machines from the US, Japan, and the Netherlands, you can still see record high imports in 2024, and you clearly see a surge in the purchase after US-China tension escalate. This is partly because of stockpiling, as they don't know when the supply might be further cut off. And then, but also truly, you can see their motivation to boost their local chip production for supply chain resilience point of view, mainly for a lot of mature node chips for consumer and cars and others. So we can still see this chart. Where are these machines comes from? Japan, Netherlands, and Singapore are the top three sources for China in 2024. Japan and the Netherlands are each sending over 9 billion worth of equipment with a significant growth in recent years. And China's direct US imports have become only fourth source from number one before the export control in 2017. So the accumulated purchase from Japan for 2020 through 2024 was 34 billion, compared with the purchase from the US is just 15 billion. We've also noticed a surge in purchase from South Korea as they provide good machines for chip packaging and memory production. So in addition to this chart, it can come back to me. China's top 5 semiconductor equipment makers, led by Nora, are all reporting record high revenue and profits last year, and that's almost the case every year since the US imposed many export control. And what we heard is that it's the most part they hope to replace first are from American vendors. So I tend to agree with NVIDIA's CEO. For one country to stay ahead, actually it's better to make others dependent on your infrastructure and technology rather than cutting them all off. But I think it's already too late to speak about this and not possible for the US to switch the course. And this China localization campaign, it's certainly on, and that is on in many aspects. Back to you, Katie.
Thank you very much, Annie. I think you really hit the nail on the head that trying to rein in one country's advances through pure policy means is quite difficult. And I know over the years you reported that sources in the supply chain have said, because the US started by restricting chips rather than the tools to make them, they were really, now they're behind the curve trying to get China to, trying to stay ahead of China. So that's a really, and that chart on the tool imports is quite stark. It really does just show how determined China is to, stay in the race. So, and I think the obviously emblematic company in this push is Huawei, which you both have covered quite extensively over the years. Cissy, could you tell us more about Huawei, kind of why it's so under fire, and what are its strengths at home? Why is it the national champion?
Yeah, sure. So Huawei is, of course, it's highly recognized in China, and to some extent, it's regarded as a national pride, particularly after the Meng Wanzhou case. And then, so it's been like it's a symbol for China to counter the US tech curbs. And then, so also the Chinese companies that we talked to told us, they are using Huawei's platforms. So those companies including like iFlyTech and SenseTime, and then they told us actually Huawei's Ascend is like it's pretty good, it's very good. And then it's also some of the management from other tech companies told me that although there's still gap between Huawei's platform and NVIDIA's platform, but Huawei is catching up very quickly. And in some extreme scenarios, if the Chinese companies are forced to shift to domestic platforms overnight, just in case the US cuts or Chinese companies access to NVIDIA's chips at all, and then the Chinese companies may spend a few more months to achieve what they expect to achieve which means the timeline may be delayed a bit, but they can still use domestic ones. It's just the process will be just a little bit prolonged. But currently the problem, one big problem with Huawei is the capacity. So, and also, which means there's a lot of demand, of course, but they cannot produce, they're not able to produce enough chips for the demand. And also, what we heard is that the defection rate of Huawei's chips is relatively high compared to NVIDIA. And then also, you know, on the other hand, some industry insiders told us that even if NVIDIA continues to degrade its chips, say its performance will be on par with Huawei's, Chinese companies will still choose NVIDIA because NVIDIA's CUDA platform is much more mature and stable, unless the Chinese government direct those companies to buy more Huawei's chips. And then back to your question, why Huawei is so on fire in the US. It's because, you know, there's some theories that if the US puts more restrictions on China's tech development, and then it actually will accelerate company like Huawei's advancement because it has the state support. So when China wants to do something, or particularly when it wants to achieve something, it will mobilize the national resources, and they will put a lot of resources and supports into which the US may not be able to compare. And then, you know, in a few years, they might able to achieve the goal.
Got it. Thank you, Cissy. That's a really interesting point about the maturity of the ecosystem. So it's not just the hardware capabilities and production capabilities, but a bit more. So might take a little longer for Huawei to catch up, but you never know how long. So, Annie, you've also covered Huawei quite in depth over the years. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I would like to bring up our studies on Huawei because their ambition is truly massive. They've gone from specializing in all sorts of chip design, previously for their smartphone to networking gears to TVs to surveillance camera, and they can build it as capable as Apple. But after export control, they really venture into chip production and even advanced chip packaging with many partners backed by local governments, and the resources is really massive. In recent years, we also exclusively report first on their move to build all types of semiconductor equipment because that is a huge bottleneck for them right now. When they face a lot of where they still face a lot of restrictions, they are investing heavily in R&D and hire a lot of top talents from companies like TSMC, Intel, Lam, and KLA, Applied Materials, so on. And they are also working very closely with China's other national champions like Display Champion, BOE, to use the best screen technologies. Often, when you suddenly see some new companies that you don't recognize popping up in recent years, doing something quite advanced in China, if you dig a little bit harder, you can usually find Huawei's influence or Huawei's backing them, or Huawei's shadow them out there. So while China is still behind in the most cutting edge chip production due to export control, they are already flooding into areas they can master. This include mature node chips that's already affect a lot of global players. But that is important because that power everyday devices from consumer electronics to cars, and also silicon carbide substrates, which are critical for power efficient semiconductors, and also some commodity DRAM memory for smartphones, because China already have their market share in all the smartphone makers is like 60%, so they will prioritize using their own DRAM. And in many other electronic components, maybe you guys did not notice, but still very important if you want to build a system from thermal management metal casings to mechanical parts, camera lens, speakers, microphones, and PCB boards. They already, like China already have a lot of global leading players out there. So back to you, Katie.
Thank you, Annie. Indeed, their large number of global players are largely thanks to companies like Apple spending so long building up their supply chains in China. So it's a bit ironic now that the US government is trying to dismantle the progress that US companies helped make. Beyond chips and tariffs, actually, there's another issue that I think is quite interesting is EVs and connected cars. It's an area of tech that China's very much interested in, put a lot of resources into, and is having a lot of global success, which is becoming an issue politically in certain markets. Cissy, this is maybe your area of specialty?
Yeah, can we bring slide 6, please? So I start first, and then we can look at the chart in one of my recent stories. So for EVs, in terms of the US tariffs, I think Chinese companies are kind of, we can say that Chinese companies are sort of immune because there are few Chinese EV brands available in the US currently. But in terms of the reciprocal tariffs, I think something worth noting is that because some American auto parts, which China doesn't produce currently, may be impacted, such as the power control chips by NVIDIA, because China is not making that. And then if China impose reciprocal tariffs, and then that will definitely impact the Chinese importers, because those chips that they are used in the very high-end cars in China. And although the direct impact of the US tariffs on Chinese EVs is minimal, I think the second effects that are, how countries need to figure out how the trade talk would be like between different countries. So one example is that the EU decided to impose tariffs. So one example is that the EU decided to impose tariffs on Chinese EVs last year, and now the US is imposing tariffs on European products, right? So now it seems, like the EU is actually willing to work with China to some extent to address the tariff issues, as it's reported, that the EU and the US, EU and China are effectively negotiating these tariffs. And finally, as we have been, reported a lot, so Chinese companies, they are aggressively expanding their overseas facilities. So we can see from the chart so we listed some of the existing Chinese overseas facilities for autos, including the knocked down and semi-knocked down models. So basically, Chinese companies, they are aggressively expanding their overseas facilities, particularly in the emerging markets. Okay.
Thanks, Cissy. That's a good overview of just how ambitious and aggressive Chinese makers have been. They're really taking the lead in an area that the US maybe is not so interested in pursuing anymore. I think there's a lot of talk about dismantling incentives for buying EVs and other green cars in the US. So this could be China's moment. So, well, thank you so much. That was a really great conversation about a very wide range of topics, the challenges, and the stress that the supply chains are under. So thank you both. Now we'd like to turn to some listener questions. So if we could do that right now. I think this first one might be good for Cissy. A viewer asks, in responding to the challenges of the tariff war, how much responsibility lies with the government and how much can be done by private companies and entrepreneurs? And what roles can businesses play in building economic resilience? Cissy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that is a very good question, because that is a question that I have seen, frequently asked among industry insiders. So, there's a lot of discussion about, how much or what percentage of the, how much can businesses do to absorb some of the tariffs? And I think, interestingly, from what I have seen, is companies are are actually acting a little bit differently. So, for example, before the 90-day truce, so Temu was actually imposing all the tariffs to the US consumers. So, which means the company is not absorbing anything. But for Shein, it's another story. What I noticed is that, and what I heard from my contacts is that Shein was actually trying to absorb some of the tariffs by itself. Partially because Shein has a different supply chain because they have their own brand, but Temu was purely more than like a third-party platform. So which means that Shein would be able to reduce some of the costs through the enhancing the so-called efficiency of its supply chains. And also another case is Walmart. So what Walmart was doing was it was asking the Chinese exporters to reduce the price. So they're not trying to absorb the price, but and that was really, really challenging to Chinese producers because Walmart has like great negotiating power. And if a Chinese producer says, no, I cannot lower the price for Walmart, so Walmart will shift to another supplier immediately. So they have a lot of choice and they're such a global company. So what I want to say is that some companies are trying to absorb some of the tariffs. And I think a lot of companies agree that they should try multiple ways to cut the cost because the motivation is that if you raise the price too much and if you shift all the tariffs burden to the buyers, you may lose buyers, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's definitely a balancing act, especially for consumer-facing companies. As you just said, you can try and pass on costs, but at the risk of losing business. So it's really tough. And for companies deeper in the supply chain who are already operating on really thin margins, I think it might be even tougher. What do you think, Annie?
Yes, yes. But I think when it comes to tariff, I'm very glad that Cissy bring up a lot from the business point of view because uh, what I heard is that when it comes to tariff negotiations, it's really government to government talks. So business owners actually can offer their opinions to trade representatives and government, but they have little power to change the negotiation direction or the total outcome. So as several Asia chip executives put it directly, we little businessmen cannot do anything but just wait for the outcome. Perhaps only like U.S. tech giants like Tesla and Nvidia, they have President Trump's WhatsApp or Signal can truly make their voices heard in and in the political circles and impact the policy. However, for non-China U.S. tech companies, it's much harder to make an impact. And when you talk to most of the supply chain executives, they'll tell you they are not afraid of changes. Many have been doing this for years. They are used to being flexible. What they really dislike is uncertainty. When changes happen, company can make adjustment and adapt. But when the uncertainty swings so widely, like just within just a few days, it becomes nearly impossible to plan. And that's what's the most unsettling part for most of them.
That brings to mind one of your recent stories where I think one of your sources said that the uncertainty now is actually worse than it was during the COVID pandemic. It was
Exactly, because you don't know what will happen. Because and then sometimes as things just go into effect like immediately.
right.
Then the direction could be depending on the emotions as well.
Right. So, thank you. That was a really, really good question. That was very insightful, and thank you for your answers.
Yeah, thank you for the audience question. Very insightful.
Yeah. Question number 2. What are likely medium-term strategies that companies are taking to plan for either higher tariffs or uncertainty? And what are Asian suppliers' options for non-US trade? Cissy, you want to dive in on this one?
Oh, yeah, sure. I think for the medium-term strategies, we have touched a little bit during our presentation. So, basically multi-sourcing and front-loading, which, a lot of companies are doing. And also for uh, global companies, I think they also explore, other markets such as Middle East and Latin America. So we have heard a lot of discussions, some of the listed companies, they have been saying that publicly, they will be more aggressively entering Latin America and Middle East because the market is pretty huge there. And then the also, but at the end of the day, the US is still the most lucrative market to all those Chinese producers. So which means they are not going to give up the US markets, even faced up with high tariffs. So they will try their best to manage, but on the other hand, explore other markets. And then actually we recently did a story. So I did a story with Annie and Lolly about, actually Beijing is encouraging the state-backed tech companies to more aggressively enter a European market, that, encouraging that to invest locally, etc., to just offset the US tariffs. And also, go back to, and I think Annie had a great point, like all the businesses are saying, they hate uncertainty. So certainty is the most important thing to them. But for certainty, I think, even if there's a administration shift in the US in 2028, a 4-year term, so may not be enough to fix all the kills, that has been currently created. So companies, do need, as we discussed, reassure to make to prevent from future chaos, whatever it is.
Right, rebuilding trust in the US policy certainty, I think, will take some time after the unprecedented uncertainty that's been witnessed lately. But thank you, Cissy, that was a very nice answer. In a related question, another listener is asking about the strategic stance that Asian countries should adopt outside of China. So with this global supply chains at risk, is it possible for these nations to remain neutral? Or will they inevitably be forced to choose sides, potentially at the cost of their own economic stability? So this is more of, I guess, a diplomatic question. Any thoughts, Annie?
Yeah, I don't know which region you're living for this question, but I really think it depends on your country's economic and trade portfolios and the real geographical location as well. I think for many companies in Taiwan and Japan, it seems hard to pick or double down investment in China right now under current circumstances. So a lot of these big tech electronics manufacturers from TSMC, Foxconn to Quanta, their biggest customers are all from the US. Like for example, 70% of TSMC's 2024 revenue are all from the US. So now if they really need to pick, they need to prioritize the US investment under this very big onshoring pressure. But for places like Malaysia and Singapore, which I often travel to because a lot of new supply chain emerging there, and also Thailand and Middle East, they are geographically far away from both the US and China. So I think it's much easier and flexible for them to still serve the both sides.
Thank you, Annie. Cissy, what have you seen in your reporting on this?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to what Annie has already said. So I think the Southeast Asian countries, they have long argued that, they shouldn't have to choose in the US and China. Oh, China is important to us, the US is also important to us. And then we have also seen actually, during Trump 1.0, Vietnam and Malaysia, they have been, arguably profited from the trade war, right? Because a lot of Chinese companies were relocated into those two countries. But now with the Trump 2.0, these countries, they are also being imposed, hiking tariffs. Although, it's currently put on hold, but again, nobody knows what will happen in another 90 days. And it also depends on what kind of individual deal that Trump reaches with countries such as Vietnam. But I think, faced with those hiking tariffs, and some countries' long-term development plan, they might be impacted, such as Malaysia's AI plan. And then if these countries inevitably have to choose between the two superpowers, and I think, it really depends on which country. I don't think we have a uniform answer for, Southeast Asia will be like this and that, because countries are so different from each other. And my personal view is that, countries like Thailand and Indonesia, because of China's strategic importance and the trade ties with them, they might accelerate, shift towards China, And then for countries like Singapore and Philippines, and they were regarded as, kind of US allies, so they may not shift to China. But for countries like Vietnam, I think it's going to be very interesting because I think they may try to, adapt to Trump 2.0. But it will also, again, it will also depends on how their bilateral negotiation with the US goes.
Thank you, Cissy. Yeah, sounds like a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of countries are put in a very difficult position by this, compounded by the fact that, a US presidential term is only 4 years, so there might be some temptation to kind of try and thread the needle until, next election. But we'll have to wait and see on that. Moving on to our next question. This is more US focused. One of Trump's and Biden's priorities has been to bring more manufacturing back to the US, particularly tech. One of our listeners asks, how difficult is onshoring of chip manufacturing for the US? I think this is something Annie has a lot to say about.
I think no matter who's entering a new geography, the learning curve is always quite steep. When you are trying to onshore manufacturing, it's not just about the chip plants. You need a whole ecosystem, enough talents, and also you need to know new regulations, new cultures. And in semiconductor manufacturing, especially for cutting edge chips, every piece of equipment and the construction and the tubes inside the fabs has to be top tier, and every drop of chemicals and materials need to be perfectly purified. Plus, the execution have to be flawless. So it's not only challenging to do that in the US, it would be quite hard to do in many different places. However, for some national security sensitive supply chains, we are seeing this faster decoupling. AI data centers are a good example. We are clearly seeing this trend of regionalization and decoupling with supply chains definitely and already shifting and diversifying out of China. This particularly shift is quite obviously going to the US from the AI chip to AI server assembly, mainly because the volume involved is in millions units of data center server racks, not like hundreds of millions of iPhones or laptops. Also, for these high-end AI data centers, the customers are the richest CSPs, Microsoft, Google, and the price tag is already very high. So they can absorb more cost. And since the whole setup of the data center is very large, it makes more sense to locate it closer to the customer's building. But when it comes to the massive assembly of iPhones to like screw tiny screws and then all those laptop assembly, I don't think that kind of onshoring will materialize over the very long term.
Thank you, Annie. That's a great question. I know you've been following TSMC's investment and fabs in the US, and you've got some great coverage on that topic if any of our listeners would like to check that out after the event. But thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, this looks like a question for Cissy. A listener asks, how will shipping prices be impacted by tariff hikes? And what is the interplay between shipping prices and tariffs? That's a great question.
Yeah, I think that is a very important question because I think a lot of people would be curious about that, and I also heard similar questions from the business community. So I mean, on the one hand, we have seen the tariff has been reduced, right, to some extent, which is still a lot actually. So, but on the other hand, we have indeed, seen the shipping price, they are insanely surging, particularly during this so-called grace period. That is mainly due to the shipping orders, they are hiking, and then plus the shipping capacity within a short term is a little bit limited. So overall, it leads to price surging in the shipping industry. So in terms of from the manufacturing end, actually it takes about 1 month to produce the orders, and then it would take about another month to ship the items to the US. So the 90-day grace period is really important for stockpiling. So which actually means that they don't have that much time given the business circle or manufacturing circle. And so an exporter told me that our current shipping rates have actually tripled currently, and then almost no shipping slots are available before June 15. And I think that really that really shows how panicked those importers and exporters are. Again, it's only because nobody knows what will happen after 90 days.
Thank you, Cissy. Yeah, once again, the uncertainty is just creating more chaos. I think that's about all the questions that we have time for. I would just like to thank both of you again for a really wonderful conversation and discussion, deep insights into the most fascinating business story today, I would argue. And I'd also like to thank our listeners for joining us today.